Hey everybody. In this video, I wanted to go over a few things of note regarding your reading for this week, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Um, so first of all, the um, the work Gulliver's Travels is a satire, and what that means is that it uses irony to um, to criticize or poke fun at certain social trends, expectations, norms in 18th century Britain. Okay, and one of the big ones is colonialism and the the practice of Britain, like many other nations in Europe, of embarking in trade and um, uh, colonization and also the enslavement of people in various parts of the world. Okay, so I wanted to introduce this idea of colonialism and talk about how it might apply to Gulliver's Travels. So this is sort of a basic definition from dictionary.com of colonialism: the control or governing influence of a nation over a dependent country, territory, or people. Um, the system or policy by which a nation maintains or advocates such control or influence. The state of, or condition of being colonial, an idea, custom, or practice peculiar to a colony. So um, in the first part of Gulliver's Travels, we have this adventurer, and though he's sort of an adventurer by accident, who ends up on this island. He is British. He ends up on an island that is controlled by people, um, essentially a race of people that has not been encountered by Europeans, the Lilliputians. And what makes the people of Lilliput unique is their stature. They're very, very small. Okay. Um, and so one of the things I want to sort of encourage you to think about as you're reading is to think about Lilliput as um, in some ways a colony of Jonathan Swift, or Jonathan Swift's character in the story. So, and what I mean by that is, even though, upon his arrival, they seem to be controlling him, right, by tying him down, by sort of dictating the terms of, his freedom and what he can or can't do. He is actually the one that is, um, uh, because of his large stature and his physical power in comparison to the Lilliputians, he is the one that um, is um, is taking their resources. It takes a tremendous amount of food, a tremendous amount of work on their part to maintain his status there. And one of the things we have to question, especially in this first part, is, okay, well, what is in it for the Lilliputians? Why do they go through this trouble? Why do they provide so many resources to the Jonathan Swift character? Okay, to make sure that he is fed, make sure that he's taken care of properly. Another source I wanted to take a look at that I think is relevant, and I will link you to this, or provide the link to this. This is from the British Library. The source is Travel, Trade, and the Expansion of the British Empire. Okay, and it mentions Jonathan Swift, but it gives an interesting background of Britain's role in the global trade. There are other articles that go more specifically into Gulliver's Travels. Okay, and also Britain's involvement in the slave trade. Okay, both of which I think are relevant. So, so for this though, what I wanted to focus on is um, the connection between Gulliver's Travels and another popular novel at the time. It's still popular, and that is Robinson Crusoe. Okay, so Robinson Crusoe, if you're not familiar with it, um, it presents itself as the autobiography of a man, and I'm reading here, who feels impelled to leave the provincial town of his birth and seek his fortune beyond the nation's shores. Okay. Um, so it's essentially an adventure story. And one of the points that's made in this article is that Gulliver's travels, are in some sense, poking fun at the Robinson Crusoe idea. As I mentioned before, Gulliver is he is sort of an adventure in some ways by accident, because of his shipwreck. Unlike Robinson Crusoe, who seeks adventure. All right. But this is the part that I specifically wanted to discuss, starting here. As many critics observe, Robinson Crusoe nonetheless provides a powerful mythic sense of Britain's freedom of movement across the globe and of their ability to master and sometimes make property of alien environments and subjugate other peoples. Crusoe's narrative is strikingly candid, for example, about his initial role as a Guinea trader, a buyer and seller of enslaved Africans. At the same time, Crusoe's self-scrutiny encompasses his ethical shortcomings as well as his heroic feats. He concedes that his companion on the island, the quote-unquote savage Friday, is the better Christian of the two men. Crusoe is a notably anxious figure, furthermore, especially when he articulates his fears about being dismembered and eaten by cannibals. And then it mentions how Swift's novel, Gulliver's Travels, is a parody. So you sort of see in Robinson Crusoe this, the way in which colonialism and trade and slavery is both presented as something exotic, as the norm, but there's also sort of an internal conflict about, about Britain's role as, as part of this, as Britain's role as a colonial force. All right. So, and Britain continued with the slave trades, until basically the early 19th century. I believe about 1820. Definitely, it definitely got out of the slave trade before the United States did. Right. So there was always an undercurrent, maybe not always, but there was an undercurrent growing of, that people were becoming increasingly concerned and troubled by the moral implications of colonialism and the slave trade. All right. But I think you see some of this internal conflict within the character of Gulliver and what happens in Gulliver's Travels, as he again sort of happens upon these people. His power and stature is, so obviously greater than the people on the island. And we're just talking about physical power or physical presence. And yet he doesn't necessarily use that force directly, but he definitely just by his presence, takes advantage of the people there. And again, they see him as potentially an ally, potentially a weapon that can serve them. But Gulliver's presence is so disruptive that ultimately, ultimately he ends up sort of draining their resources. Okay, and much in the same way that a British colony might, even if it were conducted under the best intentions, the sheer disruption of, um, a nation coming in and establishing a colony in a new land with people already present in that land, and the demands, on those people and on that land of resources, and particularly resources that will ultimately be used for trade. That disruption is inevitable. Okay, and I think, particularly with this first part of Gulliver's Travels, Swift is trying to present this idea. Now, there's a few things I just want to point out with Gulliver's Travels, a few details that, I think are interesting. One of which is how Swift deals with Gulliver's bodily functions. Okay, and this is the sort of thing that, typically in a fable type story like this is left out. But I do think it's important, to sort of understanding what Swift is doing, both satirically, but also, in terms of what he is interested in, depicting about this person, that for Lilliputian is a giant, and the problems that he presents to the people of Lilliput. So pretty early on, we have, this is after Gulliver has been tied up. When they start relaxing the cords, he has, to urinate. So I felt great numbers of people on my left side, relaxing the cords to such a degree that I was able to turn upon my right and to ease myself with making water, which I very plentifully did, to the great astonishment of the people, who, conjecturing by my motion what I was going to do, immediately opened to the right and left on that side to avoid the torrent, which fell with such noise and violence from me. Okay. And then later on, we get the issue of, well, what happens when Gulliver has to defecate? Okay, and so Swift spends a couple of paragraphs on this. Apparently he's been holding it this whole time, out of shyness or whatever. But once he gets into his enclosure and there's the temple and he has a little bit of cover, a little bit of privacy, the best expedient I could think of was to creep into my house, which I accordingly did, and shutting the gate after me, I went as far as the length of my chain would suffer and discharged my body of that uneasy load. But this was the only time I was ever guilty of so uncleanly an action, for which I cannot but hope the candid reader will give some allowance, after he has maturely and impartially considered my case and the distress I was in. From this time, my constant practice was, as soon as I rose, to perform that business in open air at the full extent of my chain, and due care was taken every morning before company came, that the offensive matter should be carried off in wheelbarrows by two servants appointed to that purpose. I would not have dwelt so long upon a circumstance that perhaps at first sight may appear not very momentous, if I had not thought it necessary to justify my character in point of cleanliness to the world, which I'm told some of my maligners have been pleased upon this and other occasions to call in question. So, so he uses, it's interesting here because, again, at first, there's a bit of a moral or personal conflict about how he should deal with, deal with defecating. He is used to this being something sort of private that he's a little bit shy about. So he goes into the giant temple where he's staying, where he has that privacy, takes care of his business. But of course, especially considering his size, and the frequency at which this will occur, this is really an issue that needs to be dealt with, and that resources need to be provided to deal with this, right? And eventually he becomes very comfortable with the idea of them having to hire workers and wheelbarrows to dispose of this. Okay. But this becomes, ultimately sort of a practical problem for the Lilliputians. This is one of the things that they have to do, the work that they have to do to sort of maintain his presence on the island. And again, the way that he sort of turns this into um, he's presenting this to sort of justify my character to the world, right? Presumably the world of Europe, to show that his actions are clean, um, you know, physically clean, but also there's the allusion to sort of moral cleanliness, that what he's doing here on this island is like morally clean, morally justifiable. And but again, disregarding the burden that he's placing on the people of Lilliput in the process. All right. And I know you might say, well, but he didn't ask to come to this island. His ship crashed, and there was a shipwreck, and he ended up there, right? But again, you remember that this is satire, right? That part of what Swift is doing is presenting these outrageous situations in order to make real commentary on on the effects of trade and colonialism on on the people who were colonized, but also to sort of demonstrate the moral gymnastics or the mental gymnastics that have to be done to morally justify those effects for the people of Britain, for the colonizers. We get a little bit later on, where the people of Lilliput start to recognize that that maintaining him is going to be problematic, or at least keeping his presence is going to be problematic for them. They apprehended my breaking loose, that my diet would be very expensive and might cause a famine. Sometimes they determined to starve me, or at least shoot me in the face and hands with poisoned arrows, which would soon dispatch me. But again, they considered that the stench of so large a carcass might produce a plague in the metropolis and probably spread through the whole kingdom. Okay. In the midst of these consultations, several officers of the army went door to door the great council chamber. And I'm just going to end there. But the part that I think is relevant is sort of this idea that they're sort of in a situation now where his presence on the island is going to be problematic no matter what. So they can, so in order to keep him alive, keeping him alive is potentially going to cause a famine. Killing him is potentially going to cause a plague, right? There's a sense of that there's a point of no return with this. That that once the colonization has occurred, once he has disrupted the status quo of Lilliput, there's really no going back, with one exception, which would be for him to voluntarily leave on, for him to be able to leave on his own, and to ultimately leave them alone. But even then, there's, even if you were to simply leave, there's still sort of a cultural and epistemological disruption that can't really be undone. I mean, if you, if suddenly you walked outside and saw a giant walking around, your sense of the world and what is in the world and your place in the world is going to be irrevocably changed, even if the giant decides to get up and leave. So, um, so one of the questions that so I addressed before, what is in it for a Lilliput to keep him alive? One of them I just mentioned, that he is, uh, that killing him, isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. Um, okay, but so they have to come up with sort of a legal framework, though, for his staying with them. And within that legal framework, you can also see that they are beginning um, uh, to understand, how he might be useful to them. Okay, so this is the sixth. He shall be our ally against our enemies in the island of Blefuscu, and do his utmost to destroy their fleet, which is now preparing to invade us. Okay. And there's a few other things. He will also aid and assist our workmen in helping to raise certain great stones. And so again, for Lilliput and the Lilliputians, they are also, trying to come up with ways to exploit Swift's character, and or the character of Gulliver. So they're trying to, come up with ways to exploit him, to utilize his presence for their, for their benefit in war, in construction and infrastructure. The difference, though, is, while in sort of, on one hand, this, this is for, this is one way that Lilliput is able to sort of like justify for themselves and validate, their decision to allow his presence. Again, it still does not account for the size difference, right? And in one way, the size is, what they want to take advantage of, but the size also, continues to create problems for them, because again of the demand of resources, of attention, of new infrastructure to account for that size. And so if we sort of equate the size of Swift with the size of, say, Britain or European military might, military power, military mobility, you might see how, a colonized people might, potentially also see benefits in having sort of that power, that might at their disposal, right? But it's always sort of based on the assumption that the colonized control the situation, when in fact they don't. And in fact, the people of Lilliput, they are only in as much control of the situation as Gulliver allows them, right? And even then, it's sort of allowing them the appearance of control over the situation. He also, again, is depleting them of resources, depleting them of manpower, and is weakening Lilliput, in the process. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say for this video. Hopefully this sort of gives you some ideas of what to look for as you are reading Gulliver's Travels. And again, we're just doing the first part, so it's chapters 1 through 3 for this week. Next week it'll be 4 through 6. But you will be writing about Gulliver's Travels as part of the final exam. Okay, so it's important to, to read it closely and consider the context. All right. Okay, so thank you, and have a great day.